After 1857, the tension and the hostility between North and South escalated, and this escalation of hostility resulted in the division and breakup of the Democratic Party, the last national party. This division of the Democrats was what allowed the rising Republican Party and its presidential candidate, Abraham Lincoln, to win big in the election of 1860. This victory by the Republicans is what prompted the southern slave states to make the move to secede from the Union and to organize themselves into a new country, the Confederate States of America, because they feared that with Republicans in charge of the federal government, they would use their power to restrict or even abolish their particular institution of slavery. What we're going to do in this lesson today is first examine these rising tensions between 1857 and 1860 that destroyed the Democratic Party. We're going to look at the election of 1860 and its impact, and we're going to end with the succession of the southern states that followed the 1860 election. So let's begin by looking at why tensions between North and South continued to escalate after 1857. One problem was that in 1857 you had another economic downturn, the Panic of 1857. You know, the Panic of 1857 was similar to the Panic of 1837 and the Panic of 1819, but it was a little different in some ways. In 1857, what brought about the financial panic was that a dramatic drop in the prices of American foodstuffs. It wasn't cotton, it was foodstuffs, things like wheat and corn and pork and beef. You see, what had happened in the years before 1857, there was a major war going on in Europe. It's called the Crimean War. This was a war where Great Britain and France were fighting as allies of the Ottoman Empire against Russia. It was fought over in the area around the Black Sea, in the Crimean Peninsula. Now, during this war, the Great Britain, which was America's major trade partner, was importing a lot of American foodstuffs. But when the war ended, that demand declined, and so when food prices declined, that's what brought about the banking crisis like what had happened in 1819 and 1837. Now, with this Panic of 1837, cotton prices remained, I mean, their prices dropped, but they remained more stable. So the economic panic didn't affect the South as much as it affected the North. Now, in the South, what the panic did was to make many Southerners believe that King Cotton, as they referred to it, that cotton, as long as the South had cotton, that their economic system would continue to be prosperous and stable. And they even believed that their ability to produce cotton made their economic system superior to the North's economic system. So it made the Southerners very proud and of their system based on cotton production. Now, the Northerners were angry because they blamed the downturn on the South, because Southern Democrats had pushed through Congress the tariff of 1857. And what this tariff did was to drop the tariff, to lower customs duties, to lower the tariff. And many Northerners believed that this had had the effect of hurting American industry by allowing cheap foreign imports to flood the American market. So from the Northern point of view, the panic had been caused by the Southerners and their support for free trade and the tariff of 1857. So you had both sides kind of pointing fingers at each other as a result of this economic panic. And panics don't put people in a good mood in general. So the whole country was very on edge. Now, another big event in 1857 that really divided the country was the Dred Scott decision. Now, who was Dred Scott? Dred Scott was a slave, and he lived originally in Missouri, but his owner was an Army surgeon who took him up north during his service. And for a while, Dred Scott had lived in the free states of Illinois and Wisconsin. Now, when Dred Scott got back to Missouri, he figured that since he had lived in a free state, that he ought to be a free man. So he took his case to the Missouri court, and the Missouri court rejected his plea. So with the support of abolitionists, Dred Scott took his case directly to the United States Supreme Court. Now, in 1857, when the court heard this plea, Southerners dominated the Supreme Court, and most of the Supreme Court justices had been appointed some years earlier by Andrew Jackson. The Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court was a man by the name of Roger Taney. He was from Maryland and a slave owner. He was someone who considered his mentor and friend to be John C. Calhoun, just to give you an idea of who Roger Taney was. So Roger Taney was the person who issued the formal decision, and the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 against Scott. So Taney was the guy who wrote the Dred Scott decision. Now, in this Dred Scott decision, Taney did more than just reject Scott's plea. He made a number of statements that were very controversial. First of all, he said that this case should never even been heard because Dred Scott was a black person and black people could never be citizens of the United States according to his interpretation of the Constitution. Second of all, he ruled that Congress could make no law ever prohibiting slavery anywhere. According to Taney, owning slaves was a right of property. I mean, people had a right to own slaves. So to deprive people of their slaves, of the use of their slaves, was to deprive them of their property and therefore a violation of the Fifth Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So he basically was saying that by making this decision, he was basically saying that earlier congressional laws concerning slavery were unconstitutional. Missouri Compromise, unconstitutional. The Compromise of 1850, unconstitutional. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, according to Roger Taney, unconstitutional. Why? Because all these laws restricted slavery. Now, there was a lot of outrage by this Dred Scott decision. Republicans and abolitionists, they considered this decision to be immoral. They believed that this was yet another example of slave power, of the Slavocrats, these southern plantation owners. They had too much power. Now, Southern Democrats, they looked at it completely different. They believed that this decision proved that their position all along was the constitutional position, that people had a right to own slaves, and that they demanded that Congress act immediately to pass a federal slave code that would protect people's right, quote unquote, to own slaves in the Western territories. Now, this decision drove a wedge between Northern Democrats like Stephen Douglas and Southern Democrats. Remember, Stephen Douglas was the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the concept of popular sovereignty, and basically the Dred Scott decision had declared his baby to be unconstitutional. So Stephen Douglas was not at all happy with this decision. It drove a wedge between North and South Democrats. Now, the Dred Scott decision set the stage for the next big event, and that would be the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the year 1858. See, in 1858, Stephen Douglas was up for re-election to the United States Senate from the state of Illinois. And the Republicans decided that they needed to nominate somebody important to challenge his re-election. So they nominated former Congressman Abraham Lincoln to challenge Douglas for his seat. Now, this Senate election in Illinois drew national attention primarily because of Douglas, because Douglas was a leader of the Democratic Party, and everybody knew that he was going to run for president in 1860. So the whole nation was watching and taking notice of these Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, in the course of these debates, Stephen Douglas alienated and angered Southern Democrats. He was giving during the debate taking place in Freeport, Illinois, he issued what became known as the Freeport Doctrine. Basically, in a nutshell, what he said was that the Supreme Court can make any decision it wants, but it's up to locally elected officials to decide whether or not to enforce such a decision. He was basically saying that the Supreme Court can do whatever it wants, but it's up to the people to enforce and to enact laws. So he was basically saying that the Dred Scott decision can say whatever it wants, but if people don't want slavery in their territory, they can act to prevent slavery from being in their territory. Now, this Freeport Doctrine, by making this statement, what Douglas did was to make his candidacy unacceptable to Southern Democrats, because remember, they believed that people ought to be able to bring their slaves wherever they wanted. Now, another important result of the 1858 debates was that as a result of these debates, Abraham Lincoln became a national figure. He went from obscure Illinois statesman to national figure. And these debates were publicized in the newspapers, and so Lincoln became known as a very charismatic and popular spokesperson for the Republican Party. There's a lot that Northern voters liked about Abraham Lincoln, you know, his story, his biography. He had a rags to riches story that appealed to the average voter in the same way that Andrew Jackson appealed to the voters. He was a man of the people. You know, Abraham Lincoln, he was born in a log cabin. He'd moved to Illinois. He had operated a flatboat on the Mississippi. He had a story. You can see where his store, he had a little country store in Illinois where he operated for a number of years. And he had gone on to become a self-trained lawyer, and a very successful lawyer at that. So here was someone who epitomized the ideals of the Republican Party, the ideals of free labor and free enterprise, somebody who had raised himself up from his own bootstraps to great success. Another thing about Lincoln was that he could appeal to abolitionists, because Lincoln made it very clear that he believed that black people were human beings that should enjoy the same unalienable rights under the Constitution as everybody else. And so he made it clear that he was against slavery. But he distanced himself from the abolitionists because they were seen as radicals by many, because in all of his public statements, he said that he did not advocate abolition. He just wanted to prevent slavery from spreading. But he wasn't against slavery existing where it already existed. So he was someone who could appeal to middle-of-the-way voters, voters who weren't radicals. So his performance, he lost that election. You know, Stephen Douglas was elected by the state legislature to be senator. But even though Lincoln lost that election in 1858, it paved his way for his success in 1860. Now, another thing that happened in the election of 1858 that was important was that Lincoln came to be seen by Southerners as being a radical abolitionist. The reason for that was that Douglas portrayed him in his speeches and in his campaign literature as a radical abolitionist. You see, Douglas knew that abolitionists were very unpopular in the state of Illinois. A lot of voters in Illinois were afraid that if abolition took place, all these black people would move up to Illinois and take away all their jobs. And Lincoln was even portrayed as someone who advocated that blacks and whites should intermarry. Now, these were all falsehoods. And Douglas put out this information because he wanted to discredit Lincoln in the eyes of the typical Illinois voter. But the problem is that this campaign literature found its way across the country. So people in the South were reading this campaign literature, and many Southerners were convinced that Lincoln was in fact an abolitionist, that he was actually secretly an abolitionist, even though he said he wasn't. So that's the one reason why in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, so many Southerners were up in arms and hysterical that an abolitionist had been elected president of the United States. Now, the year before the 1860 election was a year in which the country was on edge and tensions continued to escalate. In 1859, it got to the point that in the halls of Congress, you almost had knife fights and fist fights. And it all had to do over who would be the next Speaker of the House. The Republicans had enough seats in Congress to determine who the Speaker of the House was going to be, and they wanted John Sherman of Ohio to be the next Speaker of the House. But the Southern Democrats refused to, they took measures to block him being elected. And this standoff took place for 8 weeks, where the two sides almost came to blows. Now, what the problem was is that Mr. Sherman, John Sherman, endorsed a book that was called The Impending Crisis in the South. It had been written by a certain Hinton Helper. And this book claimed that slavery was a system that only benefited the wealthy and left the bulk of poor whites, the working class whites, in poverty. And this book infuriated Southerners. They condemned it. Now, Southerners had a book of their own that was very controversial in the North. It was a book by a Virginia professor by the name of George Fitzhugh. The book was called Cannibals All, Slaves Without Masters. And Fitzhugh argued that basically all societies throughout history require a socially inferior working class. And what Fitzhugh was arguing was that slaves were the working class of the South, just like factory workers who worked for wages were the working class of the North. And he even argued that the system in the South was superior to the North because slaves in the South were better treated, better fed, and had a higher standard of living than what he called wage slaves working in the factories and the mines up in the North. And this book was very controversial up north and condemned by Northerners. So the two sides were at odds, and eventually the crisis ended when Sherman volunteered to withdraw his name from consideration, and that ended the crisis. But even more provocative event was the raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown. Remember John Brown? He was the guy responsible for the Potawatomi massacre. What he did is he organized a group of conspirators, a group of men, and their plan was to seize control of Harper's Ferry in what it's in today in West Virginia, but it was in Virginia because there was a federal armory there. The idea was to seize control of the armory and then use these weapons to arm the slaves and start a massive slave rebellion across the South. Well, the raid did not go as planned. They occupied the armory, but United States Marines were able to, under the command of Robert E. Lee, were able to capture Brown and his men. And Brown was captured. He was tried on the charge of treason, and he was executed. So John Brown was executed. Now, the trial and the execution of John Brown was very divisive. You see, what happened is that up north, abolitionists like Ralph Waldo Emerson, they heaped praise on Brown. Brown was portrayed as this great hero, a man who was a martyr for freedom, a man who was a saint fighting for a noble cause. And Southerners, on the other hand, they were outraged that a person that they saw as a murderer and a traitor was being hailed as this great hero by the North. And they were shocked that so many prominent Northerners had ties and links to John Brown. So you can see why when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, since they viewed him as an abolitionist, you can see why Southerners were afraid there was going to be a massive slave rebellion and they're all going to die. So that was kind of like the event that happened just before the election of 1860. Now, in 1860, that would be the year in which the Democratic Party would break up. And it would be the breakup of the Democratic Party as a national party that would give victory to the Republicans. Now, in this election, Lincoln, who had gained a lot of support in the 1858 debates, he was nominated in Chicago, in his home state, to be the Republican nominee. And he called for the prohibition of slavery in the territories, and he also called for higher tariffs, which was an old call of the old Whig Party, and free land or homesteads out west for farmers. So that was the plank of the Republican Party. Now, the Democratic Party had their convention in Baltimore, Maryland, and they nominated Stephen Douglas. But Stephen Douglas was unacceptable to the Southerners. So the Southerners decided to have their own convention. They met in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, they could not stomach Stephen Douglas because he supported the Freeport Doctrine, because of his opposition to the Dred Scott decision. So when they convened in Charleston, South Carolina, they nominated as their candidate Vice President John Breckinridge of Kentucky. And the Southern Democrats, they called for the extension of slavery into the new territories and for the annexation of Cuba. Now, in the Upper South, in places like Tennessee and Virginia and Kentucky, you had a lot of people who were afraid that a civil war was going to happen. And they knew that they were right in the crosshairs. They were right in the middle between the North and the South. So in the Upper South, they did not want to be involved in a war. So they wanted to, a lot of former Whig members and former American Party members, they organized a party of their own called the Constitutional Union Party. And they wanted to reach some kind of compromise between the North and the South. And they nominated John Bell, Senator John Bell of Tennessee, for their candidate. So in the election of 1860, you basically had 4 different presidential candidates. Each had a support from a different region. Now, Stephen Douglas was, in the election of 1860, was the only candidate to campaign nationwide. And he did the worst. He won the slave state of Missouri, and he won some of the electoral votes of New Jersey, and that was it. The other Democratic candidate, the Southern Democratic candidate, Breckinridge, he carried the entire Deep South. And he won also Delaware, which was in the North, but it was a slave state. And then Bell, he carried the Upper South. So he carried Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. Now, Lincoln, he won almost all of the northern states. Now, he only won 40% of the popular vote, but you see, he won all the electoral votes of all these northern states that had large populations. So he won a majority of the electoral votes, even though he only won 40% of the popular vote. Now, when Republicans and Abraham Lincoln were elected president in 1860, of course, we see Southerners were in hysterics. They didn't know what to do. And what distressed them is that Lincoln could win the presidential election without winning a single Southern state. And a lot of Southerners asked themselves, should we continue to be in a union where at a national level we'll never be able to win the presidency? And how are we able to function when we have a party, a Republican Party, hostile to our interests running the federal government? So it was the election of Lincoln in 1860 that was basically the straw that broke the camel's back, that convinced the Southerners that they needed to go their own way and to succeed from the Union. So so secession was strongest in the Deep South, where cotton was king, where you have the most slaves, where you had the plantation economy. And between December of 1860 and the beginning of February of 1861, 6 states, all in the South, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, they all held special state conventions. And in each one of these states, they voted to secede from the Union. On February 4th, these states all sent delegates to Montgomery, Alabama. And it was there in Montgomery, Alabama, that they drafted a new constitution for what they called the Confederate States of America. Now, it only took them a couple of weeks to draft this constitution because basically it was identical to the U.S. Constitution, because they believed that what they were doing was in compliance with the spirit of the Founding Fathers. Now, they needed to elect a provisional president, so they elected Jefferson Davis, the old fire eater from Mississippi, to be the provisional president of the Confederate States of America. Now, right after they had formed, Texas, another slave state, joined the Union, joined the Confederacy in March of 1861. Now, in the Deep South and in Texas, there was broad support for the Confederacy. Up in the Upper South, where you had slave states, it was a little different story. In the Upper South, you had a lot of areas where the plantation economy and slavery wasn't very important. Like East Tennessee, for example, most people in East Tennessee didn't own slaves. There weren't plantations located there. So in a lot of these areas, there wasn't any strong support for succession. So in the Upper South, for example, in Arkansas and Missouri, they had a special state convention, but in both Arkansas and Missouri, the conventions rejected succession. Virginia had a convention, but a lot of people in the mountain parts of Virginia were opposed to succession, and so the convention was deadlocked. They couldn't reach a decision. In Tennessee, North Carolina, Maryland, Kentucky and Delaware, all slave states, there was not even enough political support to even hold a special convention, to even consider secession. Now, in this time of crisis, when states were leaving the Union, there were voices of moderation calling for compromise. One such person was from Kentucky, of course, Senator John Credendon of Kentucky. Another one was a Congressman Thomas Corwin of Ohio. And they both proposed compromise plans that basically said, let's just take the 3630 line of the old Missouri Compromise and extend it all the way to California. North would be free states, south would be slave states. Now, by this time, though, the lines have been drawn in the sand. The Republicans, they rejected that compromise because they didn't want to see slavery expanded at all, and Southern Democrats opposed it because they wanted to see slavery extended everywhere. So the compromises went nowhere. Now, former President John Tyler, he was from Virginia and a slave owner, he didn't want to see the Union fall apart, so he hosted a peace conference. He got people from both sides, and they met in Washington, D.C. And what came out of this conference was a new amendment to the Constitution, which would have basically guaranteed slavery's existence where it already existed. And actually, Republicans supported this. And this amendment was passed by Congress in 1861. But the amendment was never ratified by the states because April of 1861 was the same month that war broke out, the Civil War broke out. So now we need to talk about how that war broke out. You see, the reason why the war broke out is because basically the North and South had very different views of the nature of the Federal Union. Now, Jefferson Davis was the new provisional president of the Confederacy, and he believed that the Union was a union of sovereign states. So he believed that each state had the right to secede from the Union. So he believed that once the Confederacy had formed, it was very important for the new country to assert its independence and its sovereignty. So as soon as he got the power, he ordered that all federal armories and federal forts within the Confederacy be immediately controlled, be immediately occupied by the Confederacy. Now, you got to remember that James Buchanan was still the acting president when all this was going on. And these were his former friends. And he didn't want to see a conflict. So when these federal forts were being occupied, he did nothing. He just he was hoping to avoid a conflict. But Lincoln, when he became president, see, he was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861 as the new president. And he had a very different view of the Union. He was of the same view as Andrew Jackson. He believed that the Federal Union was a union of the American people. He referred to the Union as an indestructible, perpetual union. And he believed that secession was unconstitutional, illegal. In his point of view, a state could never succeed from the Union. A state succeeding from the Union would be like if a hand decided to leave the body. The Union was integral and united, and one part of it just couldn't leave. So Lincoln was determined that these federal forts in the South be held onto. He was not going to give an inch. So in April of 1861, he decided to send supplies to one of these federal forts that was still holding out, Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Now, the Confederate forces were determined that this fort immediately surrender. And when the fort refused to surrender, Confederate forces opened fire on April 12th, and after a short barrage of fire, Fort Sumter surrendered and the Confederate forces took it over. Now, with the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln decided to take action. Now, what he did was by executive order, he declared that people in the states of the Confederacy were in a state of rebellion. And he called for Americans, he called for an immediate army of 75,000 volunteers to fight to crush this rebellion and save the Union. See, he refused to, he didn't ask for a declaration of war because in his view, the Confederacy was not a legitimate nation and did not even exist. It was just a bunch of states in rebellion. Now, the Confederate Congress, they responded to this executive order by declaring war on the Union in May of 1861. So you have this outbreak of war. Now, with the outbreak of war in April of 1861, that changed the dynamics in the Upper South. And it was after Lincoln's executive order and the call for troops that what happened is that many residents in the Upper South were kind of alienated by Lincoln's had done. Many people thought that Lincoln's actions were illegal and the acts of a tyrant. And so what happens is that public opinion across the Upper South swung toward the Confederacy. So in North Carolina and Tennessee and Virginia and Arkansas, these 4 states joined the Confederacy in May of 1861. So as a result of Lincoln's actions, more states joined the Confederacy in the South. Now, Maryland and Missouri probably would have joined the Confederacy, but Lincoln sent troops immediately into Maryland and into Missouri and he basically declared a state of emergency, suspended civil rights, and arrested anybody who supported secession. So by force of federal forces, Maryland and Missouri stayed in the Union. Now, Kentucky was in the middle of all this, and Kentucky, the governor and the state legislature asked that they remain neutral, that they didn't want to be a part of the war, and they asked that neither side send troops to Kentucky. So Kentucky was an independent nation for a year or so. Now, when this war began, both sides believed that this war, were very confident, both sides believed that this war would be over in 6 months. They'd be home before Christmas. What they did not foresee that this war would instead last 4 years and kill anywhere between 600,000 and 850,000 Americans in this terrible war. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about this war and the eventual victory of the Union in this war by 1865.